It was a cold, gray afternoon, the kind where the world seems to move a little slower. In the corner of a bustling cafe, an old woman sat alone, sipping her tea. Her face was lined with years of stories, and her gentle eyes seemed to hold a kindness that could warm even the most distant soul. Across the room, a young man sat hunched over, his shoulders heavy with an invisible burden. He stared out the window, lost in thought, as though the weight of the world rested solely on him. The old woman noticed him right away. Something about his demeanor tugged at her heart. Perhaps it was the way his hands fidgeted nervously, or the sadness that lingered in his eyes. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should approach. But something inside her, a quiet, persistent nudge, told her that her words might matter more than she could imagine. As the young man got up to leave, the old woman called out softly, her voice steady but kind. "Excuse me, dear. Are you all right?" He paused, startled, and turned toward her. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events neither of them could have anticipated. What was it about her words that struck a chord? And how could a simple conversation between strangers lead to something so extraordinary? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. The young man hesitated, standing there with the door halfway open, caught between leaving and staying. The old woman's words hung in the air, soft yet powerful, as if they had reached past the walls he had built around himself. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was something in her gaze gentle, patient, and unassuming that made him feel safe for the first time in what felt like years. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice betrayed him, cracking under the weight of the lie. The old woman tilted her head slightly, her expression neither prying nor pitying, but understanding. "Sometimes it helps to talk," she said simply, gesturing to the chair across from her. "No pressure, of course. But if you'd like to sit for a moment, I'd be glad for the company." The young man hesitated again, his instincts telling him to walk away. But there was something about her offer so genuine, so free of judgment that made him reconsider. Against his better judgment, he found himself walking back and sliding into the seat across from her. For a while, they sat in silence. The sounds of the cafe buzzed around them, clinking cups, murmured conversations, the occasional burst of laughter, but at their table, it was as if time had slowed. The young man fiddled with a napkin, tearing it into small pieces, while the old woman waited patiently, not pushing him to speak. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders sagging further. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start wherever you feel comfortable," she said, her tone warm and encouraging. He hesitated, then began to speak, his words halting and uneven at first. He told her about the overwhelming pressure he felt at work, at home, in every corner of his life. He spoke of dreams he had once cherished, but now seemed so far out of reach, they felt like a cruel joke. He admitted to feeling like he was drowning, unable to catch his breath, and too ashamed to ask for help. The old woman listened intently, her hands folded on the table, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't interrupt or offer solutions, she simply let him pour out his heart. And as he spoke, he realized how much he had needed this, a safe space to unburden himself, without fear of judgment. When he finally fell silent, the old woman reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "You've been carrying so much on your own," she said softly. "It's no wonder you feel exhausted. But you're not alone, even if it feels that way right now. Sometimes the hardest thing we can do is let others in." Her words struck something deep within him, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He had spent so long convincing himself that no one would understand, that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But here was this stranger, someone who owed him nothing, offering him kindness without expecting anything in return. Before he could respond, the cafe door opened, and a gust of cold air swept in. A woman walked in, her face pale and drawn, as if she had been crying. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting nervously, before settling on the old woman. Her expression softened, and she approached their table hesitantly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice trembling. "But I think I left my scarf here earlier. Have you seen it?" The old woman smiled and reached down, pulling a colorful scarf from her bag. Is this the one? She asked. The woman's face lit up with relief. Yes, thank you so much. I thought I'd lost it for good. The old woman handed it over with a warm smile. I'm glad you came back for it. Sometimes the things we think are lost have a way of finding their way back to us. The young man watched the interaction silently, something stirring within him. The woman thanked the old woman again and left, clutching the scarf tightly. As the door closed behind her, he found himself wondering about her story. What had brought her to the cafe earlier? What had made her so upset? The old woman seemed to sense his thoughts. Everyone has their own struggles, she said quietly. Sometimes all it takes is a small gesture, a kind word, a listening ear to make a difference. You never know what someone else is going through. Her words lingered in his mind long after he left the cafe. Over the next few days, he found himself replaying their conversation, her voice a steady presence in the back of his mind. He started to notice things he hadn't before: the tired cashier at the grocery store, the anxious man on the subway, the quiet sadness in a coworker's eyes. One evening, as he walked home from work, he saw a young woman sitting on a bench, her face buried in her hands. She looked so lost, so overwhelmed, that it stopped him in his tracks. For a moment, he debated whether to approach her, his own fears and insecurities bubbling to the surface. But then he thought of the old woman and the way her simple kindness had touched his life. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, startled, her tear-streaked face filled with surprise. And in that moment, he realized something profound. The old woman's kindness had created a ripple, one that was now extending far beyond the walls of that little cafe. But what had brought the old woman to the cafe that day? And why had she chosen to speak to him, out of all the people in the room? The young man couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, something she hadn't shared. As he continued on his way home, he resolved to return to the cafe the next day. He needed to see her again, to thank her properly, and to understand the mystery that surrounded her. Little did he know, the old woman's story was far more extraordinary than he could have imagined, and the connection they shared was no coincidence. The next day, the young man arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, hoping to find the old woman sitting in her usual corner. The place was quieter than it had been the day before, and as he scanned the room, his heart sank. She wasn't there. He ordered a coffee and sat at the same table they had shared, unsure of what to do next. As he stared at the swirling steam rising from his cup, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? She? Why had she chosen to speak to him? And why did it feel like their encounter was more significant than just a random act of kindness? He had no answers, but he knew he couldn't let it end there. Just as he was about to leave, the barista approached him with a curious expression. "Hey," she said, holding out a small envelope. "The lady who was here yesterday asked me to give this to you if I saw you again." His heart skipped a beat as he took the envelope, the edges worn as if it had been handled many times. Inside was a handwritten note, the old woman's elegant script flowing across the page. "Dear friend, I'm so glad we crossed paths. Sometimes life has a way of bringing people together at just the right moment. You may not realize it yet, but you have the strength to overcome whatever challenges you're facing. Trust yourself and don't be afraid to reach out to others. If you'd like to talk again, you can find me at the park near the river most mornings. I'll be the one feeding the ducks. Take care, a friend." He read the note twice, his emotions swirling. There was something comforting in her words, as though she had known exactly what he needed to hear. Without hesitation, he decided to find her. The next morning, he arrived at the park just as the sun was beginning to rise. The air was crisp and the river glistened under the soft golden light. As he walked along the path, he spotted her sitting on a bench, a small bag of breadcrumbs in her lap as she tossed pieces to a group of eager ducks. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up with a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, patting the empty spot beside her. He sat down, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "I got your note," he said. "Thank you for writing it." I I think I needed it more than I realized. She nodded, her gaze drifting to the river. Sometimes we just need a little reminder that we're not alone, she said. I've learned that the smallest gestures can make the biggest difference. He hesitated before asking the question that had been on his mind since their first meeting. Why did you talk to me that day? Out of everyone in the cafe, why me? The old woman was quiet for a moment, as though carefully choosing her words. Because I've been where you are, she said finally. I know what it feels like to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, to feel like you're drowning. And I know how much it can mean when someone reaches out, even if it's just to say, I see you. Her words hit him like a wave, and he realized just how much wisdom and compassion she carried. He wanted to know more about her, about the life that had shaped her into someone who could touch others so deeply. Over the next hour, she shared pieces of her story. She spoke of a time when she had felt lost and alone, struggling to find her place in the world. She told him about the strangers who had shown her kindness when she needed it most, and how those moments had stayed with her, inspiring her to pay it forward whenever she could. Her words resonated with him, and he found himself opening up even more, sharing thoughts and fears he had never voiced before. With every exchange, he felt a little lighter, as though the burdens he had carried for so long were beginning to lift. Their conversations became a regular occurrence, and as the days turned into weeks, he noticed a change in himself. He started to see the world through a different lens, finding moments of connection and meaning in places he hadn't before. He reached out to old friends, repaired strained relationships, and even found the courage to pursue a passion he had long abandoned. But the old woman's impact didn't stop there. The ripple effect of her kindness continued to spread, touching the lives of everyone he interacted with. He began to share the lessons she had taught him, offering a listening ear or a kind word to those around him. One day, as they sat by the river, he turned to her with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. You've helped so many people, he said. But who helps you? She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a quiet wisdom. Kindness has a way of coming full circle, she said. Every time I help someone, I feel a little stronger, a little more connected to the world. And seeing you grow, seeing the way you're spreading that kindness to others, that's all the help I need. Her words stayed with him long after their meeting, becoming a guiding principle in his life. He realized that the true miracle wasn't just in the old woman's words, but in the way they had inspired him to create change, not only for himself but for others. Years later, he found himself sitting in a cafe, much like the one where they had first met. Across the room, he noticed a young woman sitting alone, her shoulders hunched and her face clouded with worry. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he should approach. But then he thought of the old woman and the way her kindness had changed his life. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked over to her table. Excuse me, he said gently. Are you all right? As the young woman looked up startled, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. And in that moment, he understood the true power of a kind word, a listening ear, and the courage to reach out. The old woman's lesson had come full circle, and her ripple of kindness continued to spread, touching lives in ways she might never know. And in the end, that was the true miracle, a reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can create waves of change, leaving the world a little brighter for everyone.